Welcome to the Oxygen Advantage podcast with your host, Oxygen Advantage founder Patrick McKeown. With the Oxygen Advantage podcast, we aim to show how functional breathing is an essential part of a healthy and well-balanced lifestyle. Each episode, we meet experts in their field from around the world and talk about their lives, their experiences, and how they learned the importance of breathing. Join us and get inspired. Get the Oxygen Advantage.
If you're a runner, you're going to have to listen to this podcast, and I will genuinely say that. I'm joined by David Jackson, or Jacko, as he likes to be known, and he's written a new book, which I've had the privilege of writing the foreword for, and it's out on the 12th of March, 2026. I said that this book will be a game changer. This book will be a disruptor in running. And this conversation is about that people are missing an integral part of what they can do to improve their performance. And maybe there's a lack of awareness, maybe there's a lack of understanding, but I can see this going mainstream. That's our goal, both of our goals. So, Jacko, you're very welcome. It's a pleasure to talk
Thanks
to you.
for having us.
Well,
first, thanks for writing the foreword.
My privilege, delighted to do it was, absolutely, because it's really, I think it's a book, when I was reading through your book as well, it's so well written, it's so well researched, it covers a lot of angles, and it's going to be an amazing inroad into the whole, anybody involved with running. We're talking about recreational right up to competitive and everybody in between, what they can do, just it's only tweaking, sometimes we think with breathing, it's all of these things and these routines to do, but you breathe while you're running. So if you're running, you might as well breathe right, huh?
Yeah, and I think you touched on it right at the start with the sort of assumptions or the misconceptions that we have. Like, I come from a place where I had all of those as well. I first came across your work with the Oxygen Advantage, where I was looking at breathing purely from a brain health perspective and a nervous system regulation off the back of the brain injury that ended my rugby career. And even after I'd felt the benefits of doing that work for brain health, I was at the time working as a strength and conditioning coach with athletes, runners, swimmers. How breathing is so important for swimmers, and we didn't consider it at all. And we certainly didn't with any of the runners. I didn't come across breathing in any of my strength and conditioning education. So even though I'd had this experience with it helping my brain health, my sleep, my nervous system regulation, it wasn't until I somehow knocked over a minute off my 5K time at a park run that I'd never been to before, where I finished the run. And I didn't even look at my watch, because it's one of the first stories in the book, so I can introduce it. I didn't even look at my watch because I didn't feel like I'd worked that hard. So I was like, there's no way this could be a PB. And then when I'd looked down at my watch and it was like 19, 17, I'd never got under 20 minutes for a 5K. It felt impossible, if you like. And all I'd done for 4 weeks was go to a park run. So it was only my 4th run of training. And I was trying to, rather than let the auto sort of hijack my breathing and me just be panting, I wasn't doing strictly nasal breathing. All I was trying to do was keep a level of control to my breathing so I could breathe a little deeper with a little bit more control. And that was it. And once I looked down at that watch, I was like, wow. Like, it confused me. Like, it challenged my own misconceptions, if you know what I mean, as well. And I was like, what's going on here? And that's where it started. That's where I started then going, okay, this isn't just about brain health. This is about like exercise performance. And I guess one of the things I straight away thought of was, I wish I knew this when I was playing professional rugby. And I guess that's quite a driver behind the coaching that I do with athletes. This is something that I missed out on, and want to share that with people. And I think the angle with running is that, as you said, every time you're running, you're breathing, and running has this there's no chaos of the sport of rugby is like, there's all sorts of stuff going on. Whereas running, you can just be you, your steps and your breath, and it's very cyclical in its nature. And I think as you see from when you look at any of the research as well as any of the experience, and you talk to all the coaches and people that I've interviewed in the book, you're missing out on a better experience of running and all the potential benefits you're going to get in terms of physical, mental performance and recovery.
I wonder why it's not better known. I've seen this space for over 2 decades, and yet I know if I go down to my local gym in Mycullen, which is only about 3 miles away, 95% of people in there with their mouths wide open. You talked about tweaking 2 things there with your breath. You were taking fuller breaths but less of them. And straight off, the physiology will tell you it improves alveolar ventilation. Is it just that people feel that breathing is just take a deep breath or something like that? It's almost that people are just scratching the surface, whereas we can influence so many different stages of the breath.
Yeah, I think we've missed it. I think that it was an interesting question I asked every person that I interviewed for the book, like whether they were a runner, whether they were a researcher, whether they were a coach. And I was like, why has it been overlooked? And everyone gave a similar answer. Like when I asked you, it was like no one had a definitive answer of like, oh, it's because of this. Whereas there's a few things that I think, having asked a lot of people in that space, I think that there's a long-standing assumption in physiology that the lung is overbuilt for exercise. Despite it was Professor Dempsey in 1985 gave a lecture which was then published published as a paper in the year afterwards in 86, showing that the lung isn't overbuilt for exercise. It's actually underbuilt for exercise. Over 85% of someone's VO2 max, which no one just sort of, because it was so the opposite of what everyone believed, no one believed it. But we're starting to turn around with that now. So I think that holds us back a little bit. But things are changing gradually, a lot from the work that you've done. And I think the other thing is that because breathing is both automatic as well as you can take conscious control of it, I think we've led to this assumption that something that's automatic you shouldn't mess with, and your body will just manage it as best you can. And one of the points that I make is the minimum effective, I'm going to forget the phrase now, but essentially your body wouldn't possibly choose a way of breathing during exercise that wasn't optimal. And I think that's a brilliant point, that because breathing is automatic, we shouldn't change it. Yeah. And do you know what? That could be the driving factor. What if you shit at breathing? Do you know what I mean? It's like... Yeah. But it's true. It sounds crazy. I sometimes stand in front of a group of athletes and go, okay, so out of this team here, who's the best at breathing? And they look at me like, are you crazy? Like, what sort of question is that? And I'm like, well, I'm interested to know, because we could measure some things. Who's got the best ventilatory efficiency? Like, there's some things we could actually measure, and everyone's a bit like, oh, we've never considered it.
Yeah. The rate of perceived exertion is often influenced by the sensation of breathlessness or air hunger. How true is that? And the other question that I'm going to put to you now is, can you change it? So when you talk about ventilation efficiency, for the listener to get some take-homes here in terms of what they can do.
Yeah, so, there's a lot in those few little questions. And this is what's brilliant about breathing, this simple thing of breathing. There's so much in it, right? So yes, if you do something like a VO2 max in a lab, you're going to get a researcher that doesn't believe you can influence that. That was my experience. But then they'll gather a load of data, and then they'll say to you at the end, this is your VO2 max, these are your ventilatory thresholds, and they won't give you any of the information about the efficiency of your breathing. I had to ask, well, can I have the data? They were like, why do you want that? It's not good. We don't look at that. And I was like, well, but I want to look at it. And they were really cool then. They sent me the raw data. And then it was like, certain things that you can look at in terms of going, that improving alveolar ventilation that you described earlier. So breathing a little deeper and fuller, but slower, is going to increase the percentage of oxygen you're able to extract from each breath. So you can actually get more oxygen in for no more actual air per minute. And how you're breathing when you're running will influence that. So if you're taking shorter, shallower breaths, you're going to have to take more of them and breathe more air to get the same amount of oxygen out. So you don't have to breathe as much if you're doing it efficiently. And I think the word that I've come across for breathing that seems to resonate with people is that idea of efficiency. If I present to those athletes that think I'm crazy talking about breathing, but say, would you like to be more efficient at breathing? Just that the concept of efficiency, we understand that's like, yeah, that's a good thing. Even if I don't fully understand exactly what you're talking about, I get that that's a good thing. So when you're being more efficient with your breathing, you can then essentially not just breathe a little slower, which will change your perception of effort, but also you just actually don't need to breathe as much air. And this is one of the things that we see with elite runners. They breathe more efficiently. They increase tidal volume, some of which all the way up to exhaustion, which an amateur runner will get limited by their tidal volume and then have to so they can't take a bigger, deeper breath. They just have to breathe faster. And the faster you're breathing, the more feedback loops the brain of that stress response and the higher someone's perception of effort. And the question I started to ask myself when looking at all of this was, okay, rather than why are the elites naturally doing it? Why is it natural or are they trained? Is looking at going, okay, what are the things that are limiting my ability to expand that rib cage, to increase my tidal volume, to control the speed of my breathing? And if I know all of the ingredients that make that up, then which of those ingredients can I actually influence? Can I influence how much the rib cage expands with breathing mobilizations? Yes. Can I influence like the strength or function of the diaphragm? Yes. The position of the rib cage, how does that affect the zone of apposition? So you start to stack all these things up that go way beyond an initial conversation that a lot of people have where we go, oh, is it nose breathing or mouth breathing? And you're like, well, that's one of the questions, but then there's everything below that we need to be talking about as well. I mean, I think for some people, if they get put off by the nasal breathing things, they've tried it once with no other like advice or help and they've gone, oh, well, that was hard, that didn't feel better instantly. So they just think everything's a load of rubbish, whereas there's so much more to it than that. Yeah. But definitely perception of effort is a key one. The research is showing now that your speed of breathing is more closely linked to your perception of effort when running than your heart rate or your blood lactate levels, which we think they're like the gold standard. The interesting thing with breathing rate is for researchers is it's more difficult to measure it as a like a portable device. But the thing that I'm like an S&C coach at heart, just a practitioner. So it's like all I need to know is not the exact number of breaths per minute that I'm taking when I'm running. I just need to know that information that we've just said that goes, if you're in control of your breathing rate, you're in control of your perceived exertion. Cool. Like I need to make sure I'm training my ability to control the speed of my breathing and the ingredients that go into that. The number actually doesn't matter. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's great. Time Wear brought out this jersey as well that some of the Tour de France cyclists were wearing, and it's observing respiratory rate and other metrics as well. So when you talked about, just for people who may be new to this, so when we're talking about breathing, we're never just focusing on the number of breaths per minute, which will be the respiratory rate per minute. We're also considering tidal volume, which is the volume of air drawn into the lungs, into the body with each breath. And normally during rest, it's about a half a litre. And during more intense physical exercise, it's about 2 litres. When you're talking about working with elite athletes, what do they increase their tidal volume to? Like, this is the extent of the human lungs. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? To go from, say, 12 breaths per minute at rest at a half a litre, giving you 6 litres, right up to what an elite athlete. So just to explore that a little bit.
Yeah. So and to add in another little layer, as well as what those volumes are, there is how we're actually filling those lungs up. So if I'm getting, say, 2.5 litres in, but how I'm doing that may also influence how efficiently the oxygen is being uptaken in the lungs. But yeah, it'd be fairly-ish normal to see some elite athletes getting up to like 2.5 litres, 3 litres. But those that struggle, those whose rib cage is tight, diaphragm, not all of the elite athletes I've worked with that are, Olympic athletes or international rugby players, etc., like they're not all amazing breathers. It's almost like they're amazing at their sport despite actually being not that good at breathing. So a little bit of work on their diaphragm and a little bit of work on mobilizing the rib cage actually helps them in real time, in one session, measure it before, measure it afterwards. Someone can go from like breathing 2.5, 2.6 litres of air during an exercise test to, now they can breathe 2.8, 2.9, 3 litres or even more. And I think that's one of the things that you can change straight away is if I can, the ribs connect into the spine and there's joints there where the ribs are articulating with the thoracic spine. Your thoracic spine itself is a really important like body part for your running posture and also like your running mechanics, but also where your rib cage sits and how it actually moves. So it's not something you have to practice for 6 weeks to see a difference. If you can get your rib cage expanding a little better and get it in a better position, not only will it affect your like running mechanics and running economy, so you don't even just use as much oxygen as you run, let alone improving the efficiency of your breathing, then we see that you can actually take a bigger, deeper breath rather than being restricted by all of the tissue and fascia and everything around that rib cage and around that diaphragm. And a lot of those muscles are muscles that get really tight with runners. Hip flexors, so it's major muscles that attach into the hip, like are interconnected with your spine, your ribs, and your diaphragm. So you can make some real change in that area in one session. Like I've seen it time and time again, and sort of tell some stories in the book about those.
And even for people, if they're starting off, say, with nasal breathing, and yes, as you said earlier on, there's a little bit of a load there. Because, of course, the nose imposes a resistance to your breathing that's 2 to 3 times that of the mouth. Even if people are just conscious of taking a slightly fuller breath but slower breaths, they're still going to get some benefits to it, and it will reduce the sensation of breathlessness. And one could argue you're adding an extra load both from a biochemical point of view and a biomechanical point of view. And there's an oxygen saving there because the respiratory system doesn't have to work so hard. So less oxygen is going to the respiratory system, so more oxygen then is for the rest of the body. People transitioning from mouth to nasal breathing, a lot of people, do they say to you that breathing through my nose, and they say, oh yeah, you want me to sprint with my mouth closed, I think it's important we have a conversation on that because we're realistic as well, aren't we?
Yeah. So there can be a little bit of a mixed bag in terms of everyone's got their own, there's a whole mixture of things go into someone's ability to breathe well whilst exercising, whilst running, and to breathe well whilst mouth breathing or to breathe well whilst nasal breathing. Those ingredients are the same. Someone's, when we're going for talking about nasal, someone's the size of their nose, the size of their airway, all those things are going to go into play, which are a little bit outside of our control unless you're going to use a nasal dilator. But, just the structure of your face and everything, you can't really change that much. There is a secret hidden gem of a muscle that connects your airway with your diaphragm and goes all the way down to your big toe for your deep front line. So the tongue is something that you can influence, is something you can train. And the thing that I've seen time and time and time again is when we've got somebody that's tried nasal breathing but found it very difficult, and I was one of them. I managed about 50 meters down the end of my road at a very slow pace. And it was just like snot pouring down into my mouth. It was just like horrendous. I was not good at breathing. So I know what that feels like. But particularly if you've got like quite a small nose and a narrow palate, we need to stack everything else in your favor. It is not just a case of nasal is better than mouth. And if I just close my mouth, all of my problems are solved. And that's something that I made the mistake of. The tongue being in the roof of the mouth and actually training the tongue, getting some tone in the tongue, the alignment of your jaw, the position of your jaw, your palate being stacked on top of your throat, like trying to get all of these things in good alignment so the airway's got a decent chance of actually ventilating a reasonable amount of air and being able to activate your diaphragm effectively rather than say if I've been stuck in a daily habit of like just upper chest, shallow breathing, when I'm sat at rest at the start of, say, a workshop I'm delivering, everyone will have their mouth closed because they're just sat there relaxed. But they might be all, or a lot of them might be upper chest breathing. And then just because we then start exercising, they don't start using the diaphragm all of a sudden, even though I've gone, right, I want you to use the nose for this specific thing. So getting them to, so if I get the tongue in the right position, get some, that connection with the diaphragm, and actually give them some like static exercises initially just to feel the diaphragm and get the diaphragm moving, and then try some of your nasal breathing with running or whatever exercises you're doing. And if you ask those people, can you run a faster pace now, nasal breathing, than you could when all you did was just shut your mouth? Everyone says yes, and you see the difference. So we've got to give people the tools to then use this tool, which can be transformational for people's experience of running, but as well as performance. So everything from, I'm just doing running for my general health and longevity. It's difficult to put an argument together for that person to be mouth breathing, other than they need to do something high intensity to help with some VO2 max, because some of those metrics seem to line up with like longevity, but I'm still not convinced that type of person really needs to do any mouth breathing whilst they're running. Whereas if we're looking at like an elite athlete or a professional athlete or someone that's trying to push their limits a little bit more, if your nasal threshold, so your threshold for being able to oxygenate your muscles sufficiently with your nose, that may be beyond what you could physically actually do. But people we don't really have any idea of like what this may be. I tested mine out in the lab for the book as like some research, and I was able to ventilate 80 litres of air through my nose. One of the things I did that really makes a difference for me is I didn't wear a nasal dilator, but wrapping, I call it turtle power because you sort of make yourself look like a turtle. You wrap your top lip around your top teeth and it creates some tension around the nose that when I breathe in strongly, I can actually get more air. So I think I was something like 60 litres of air whilst not doing that. And then when I switched to what I call turtle power, I was able to increase something like 26% more air up to like 80 litres, which was 87.5% of my VO2 max. I was running at about 20 minutes for a 5K type of pace. Like, so it's a decent running pace for me, but I was able to go faster. And when this story actually rounds up a lot of the stuff we've talked about quite nicely. When I switched to mouth breathing, I was able to ventilate 126 litres of air. So way more air. And it did result in more oxygen, but a lot less efficiently. So even though from 80 to 120 is like 50% more, if my maths is right, but I didn't get 50% more oxygen. 50% more air, but because that air was coming in not an as efficient way into the lungs, I wasn't getting 50% more oxygen. I did get more oxygen, so it was obviously helpful, and I ran at a faster pace. So yes, it's helpful when you're trying to push your limits, but it was less efficient. So I think hopefully that rounds up a few of those efficiency sort of things within that.
Yeah, totally. And it kind of brings me back to Morton's study. So this was the paper written back in 1995, whereby they rounded up a group of individuals. They said, okay, guys or girls, you're going to breathe through your nose right now, and we'll test you. And they found that their VO2 dropped, but they also found that their VO2 didn't drop as much as the reduction in ventilation. And
yes.
Sometimes that can put people off, that, if you're taking less oxygen, less air into your system, and nasal breathing will do that. But your point there was when you're breathing in and out through your nose, you're harnessing nasal nitric oxide, you're taking the air into the lower regions of the lungs. There's a better gas exchange. Hemoglobin picks up oxygen, but with the increase of carbon dioxide and the drop to blood pH with nasal breathing, hemoglobin is releasing oxygen more readily to the tissues. So this comes back to it, Jacko. It's not necessarily about the volume of air that you bring into your body. We have to be thinking downstream, and we have to say, can you breathe less air and still have adequate oxygenation?
Yeah. And that's, I guess, Professor Dallam, who you obviously know and interviewed him for the book, to put a figure on it, say, and he's probably researched the most about nasal breathing, or is significantly up there, isn't he? That if nasal breathing is restricting your total ventilation by about 20%. So for me, if my total ventilation was like 100 and then I was at 80, then like that 20% difference would mean that actually breathing 80 litres of air, you should be able to oxygenate sufficiently. Again, I invested in a muscle oxygenation device. So rather than using pulse oximeters, looking at what's going on in the muscle tissue, because ultimately that plays a key role. And am I actually getting oxygen there sufficiently enough? So if I'm just using my example, because I know what the data is for it. If I'm anything under 87.5% of my VO2 max, there isn't really any benefit to me mouth breathing in terms of my breathing efficiency and getting oxygen there. The only thing that sometimes it can feel nice to do if I'm like trying to push myself in a race or something is go, okay, do I relieve a little bit of sensation of air hunger? Does the airflow feel easier to do when I allow myself to do some mouth breathing within that like race sort of event? And if there's a little bit less resistance for my diaphragm and intercostal muscles to overcome during inhalation, so long as I know how to keep breathing as efficiently as I can mechanically with the mouth very small, I might get a little, or this is something I've definitely experienced, is like in a race setting, using the nasal for like training, but then in a race setting, if I am trying to actually push trying to set a new PB, and I know I'm going beyond that 87.5, I'm not going to make myself feel a bit uncomfortable with that air hunger. I'm going to sort of let that go. And there's some studies that have been done on this where they've taken people through like 4 to 6 weeks of nasal only in their training, and then that increases their 5K time. But in their 5K time, they let the mouth breathe. So there's this interesting notion where the nasal breathing becomes like it has to be on the table as one of your training modalities to go, okay, if I train nasal breathing for 4 to 6 weeks, it will improve my nasal breathing and it will improve my mouth breathing performance. So for an athlete, it then becomes like quite simple to go, okay, when you're doing your nasal breathing, work out which sessions that you can oxygenate sufficiently with nasal breathing and then use it there, definitely. But whilst you're doing that, work on the tongue, work on the diaphragm, work on your rib cage position, like get all of the pieces of the puzzle together, use those training sessions to improve your mouth training sessions if you're the type of athlete that is working at an intensity where you do actually need to use the mouth. And that point, that threshold is going to be one thing I want to say that's really important on this is that threshold at which you can nasal breathe sufficiently and oxygenate sufficiently is different for everyone as your starting point. It's going to depend on the size of your nose, your conditioning as an athlete or a runner, your CO2 sensitivity, your stress levels, your perception of exercise, how tight your rib cage is, because there's receptors around the rib cage and your diaphragm. All those things go into it. And you can train a lot of those things. So that whatever your starting point is, it's going to get better. Whether you become someone like David Rudisha that ran an 800-meter world record nasal breathing or not it almost doesn't matter. Your starting point is just unique to you. There's a whole load of these ingredients that you can train, and it's going to improve what that improves.
So if we take all of that on board, so the feeling of air hunger during physical exercise will often set the limits of intensity and endurance. If the individual feels that the air hunger is just far too much. So what we're saying is, if the issue is a breathing issue in terms of air hunger, we can target that sensation of air hunger and we can lower it. So we can train the body to do physical exercise with less effort, in other words. Can we go through some of those factors? So you mentioned CO2 tolerance, reducing CO2 sensitivity. You mentioned the breathing mechanics.
The mechanoreceptors. Yeah.
This psychological sensation of air hunger, because physical training doesn't necessarily change your breathing patterns. And you made a point earlier on. Many athletes, elite athletes that you've worked with, you've seen dysfunctional breathing or poor or less than optimal. If we just say less than optimal breathing patterns. And we know that figure from one paper that was done in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research from a biomechanical point of view, 90% of individuals had suboptimal breathing. And it didn't matter whether they were recreational right up to professionals and everybody in between. So coming back one step, Jacko, sorry now, this is a long-winded question for you.
No. Yeah, those
all
different
of the points that we can change with breathing, because ultimately it's about what is the effort that you perceive when you do physical exercise, and do you want to do physical exercise with less effort? How can we change that, and what factors are we looking at?
Yeah. And if I'm allowed to just start with a tangent, is because you said something that just really made me think of someone. I've had Olympic athletes where I've go into the first session. It's like, right, we're going to do some assessments. We're going to get into some really cool stuff. And it's like, I've got all these, one but so I don't want to name names, but just people, some people doing some really cool sports as well. Not just, well, it makes me sound like running isn't cool, but anyway. And we get stuck at you can't use your diaphragm. And I'm thinking I can't do anything more sexy or advanced. You can't activate your diaphragm consciously. If you can't activate it consciously, it's never going to happen subconsciously when you're in an Olympic final under loads of stress. I remember doing it's been a whole sessions before where just can't it's just not happening. So people that say oh yeah, do this and your diaphragm, it's not always as simple as that. The thing that I then get super excited about is you're this amazing athlete, and what some people describe as the most important muscle in your body, your diaphragm, because it's not just a breathing muscle, postural stabilization, all that stuff as well. You don't even use it, or you don't even know how to. And so all sorts of things start to get better with athletes like this. And I'm this is, if an athlete comes in and they're you test everything and they're pretty amazing and world-class at everything, you're okay, you haven't really trained breathing before, but you're actually pretty good. There's only a small amount I'm going to be able to add on to you here. Whereas for someone that's not using their diaphragm, it's there's this whole new world of max squat, boom, straight up, from being able to breathe better, because being able to create better stabilization through that. But then just everything, being able to recovery, sleep, all those extra things on top, as well as the actual physical exercise, because we haven't even touched on that yet, have we? But you talk a lot about that through. Yeah, but you've got all of that sort of stuff on top as well. So yeah, I just think there's a point to make there on that type of thing with athletes. So back to the original question. I came across a bit of interesting research that was highlighted two distinct sensations. One was an air hunger sensation, but the other sensation was effort of the breathing muscles. And they had the participants seem to have those two sensations separate. And I think the air hunger being related to CO2 sensitivity, but the effort being more linked to the mechanoreceptors around the diaphragm and rib cage. And so what that started to make me realize was well, hold on a minute. Because I always kept coming, whenever I found some new research, I always started coming back to well, what do we know that elites actually do that amateurs don't? And we had amateurs, rather than increasing tidal volume, they just breathe faster. Elites increase tidal volume, control the speed they're breathing. In order to increase my tidal volume, I've got to have good use of my diaphragm. I've got to be able to expand that rib cage. And if I can't expand that rib cage, my tidal volume is going to be restricted. And then what's this? So that's my amateur athlete. Then if my rib cage and diaphragm is tight and is restricted, I can't increase my tidal volume, I'm not actually activating those stretch receptors, those mechanoreceptors in the lungs and the rib cage and the diaphragm. So my effort of breathing is going to feel harder. So when we flip it back to the elite runner that's probably got I tested some elite runners that had never done any breathing exercises ever. And they had a Bolt score, sat in a cafe after drinking a coffee, and it was 63 seconds. So really good CO2 sensitivity. And we can argue as to why, whether it was natural or their training did or whatever, but they just did. So level of air hunger for that runner whilst running he's gonna have to run pretty fast to feel that level of air hunger. as an elite runner, if he's also able to increase his tidal volume rather than just breathe faster, he's also getting some activation of those like stretch receptors in the lungs, ribcage, diaphragm to reduce that sensation of effort. And this is something people can put into place like straight away. When you're out running, just notice what your breathing's like and just notice what the auto is and just explore and just wonder to yourself like, well, what if I breathed a little bit deeper, try to expand that rib cage a little lower down a little bit more, take a bigger but slower breath. What is that doing for the sensations that I'm feeling? Whether you describe them as air hunger or effort of breathing, but just what that feels like. You're going to notice a difference straight away because it is changing. It's sending different feedback loops to your brain. So you're going to feel something that's different. Sometimes that extra cognitive thought can be a bit off-putting or can feel like it's taking up a bit of energy because I'm having to think about it at first. But I would encourage people not to be put off by that too much because you're over time, and it doesn't take long. If you actually are breathing more efficiently and better, your brain likes it. It doesn't not like it. So it's gonna come and feel natural quite quickly if you're doing it right.
People now might be asking the question, well, I'm hearing all of this information, but how do I know how well I breathe? So you mentioned the Bolt score, which is giving you feedback of your chemosensitivity to carbon dioxide. And you talked about your athlete there with a 63-second Bolt score. I would suggest for the listeners to give their Bolt score a go. I don't know if you've come across the Perceived Breath Mastery Scale by Rory Darkins.
Yeah, well, I saw the interview you did with him, yeah.
I actually think it's brilliant. Now, it's very kind of akin with what we're doing anyway, because he read The Oxygen Advantage. He was a psychologist. He got into breathing. Yeah. He's married to quite an elite athlete as well, runner. And he devised this scale and it's validated. So if I was to make a suggestion to anybody listening, if you want to check in and get a sense of how well you breathe, I think the Perceived Breath Mastery Scale is wonderful. I think the Bolt score is useful because it's so simple. You know, none of these scales are perfect. What else could you say there in terms of, do you think that's sufficient? Because it's going to be a question that listeners are going to have.
Yeah, I've got a couple of, I guess, really something really simple that I always say is, are you in control of your breathing? Or is your breathing controlling you? And there's a little bit of that in the breath mastery, isn't it? Like, can you use your breathing in these types of situations? But that, if I'm feeling stressed or if I'm running, if I'm doing something, like, do you feel like you're in control? Or is it literally controlling you? If you're the type of person that doesn't really like running, you like everyone else getting into running. Running's becoming massive at the moment. It's like, I'd like to be good at running. There was a point in my life where I didn't like coffee, right? And everyone was drinking coffee. All my mates drinking coffee. And I was like, so I taught myself to I remember the first coffee I had, I hated it. And I was like, my Catherine was like, we'll get a latte and whatever. And it was like, you know, everyone was doing it. So I felt like I was missing out. I mean, that shows you how probably shallow I am. I don't know, or whatever, but we like to fit in, don't we? But you might be one of those people where it's like, everyone's running, I want to run, but you go and run, it just feels horrible because there's nothing worse than feeling out of breath, you know. Our fear response is related to that. I had it when a year after recovering from my brain injury, which was back in 2013, which started almost all this. It started this process, but I didn't even know it was the start of this process. I couldn't run. I remember trying to go on a run with my wife, and I couldn't even manage 2 kilometers. And I didn't know I just put it down to like, okay, you've been injured and and you're just deconditioned and blah, blah, blah. I had no idea at that point, like, how bad my breathing was. You know, about 4 years later, I discovered a 7-second Bolt score when I came across the Oxygen Advantage for the first time. And it was like, you know, all these sort of eye-opening experiences started to fall into place. But I know what it's like to not be able to run because you just can't manage those sensations. And we just typically say, well, I'm unfit. But then it's like, we might also be unfit, but is your inability to control your breathing becoming a barrier for you enjoying exercise? Not even just enjoying exercise, just taking part in exercise. And I think that's a problem. That's something that I think we can address really, really quickly and really easily, because it's not that difficult to be, are you in control of your breathing or is your breathing controlling you? It's not that difficult to be I'm in control of my breathing. But in order to do that, I think one of the key things is you've got to be able to control the speed, and you've got to be able to use your diaphragm. So one of the assessments I've put into the book is what I utilize or call a diaphragm activation test. Like, can you consciously activate your diaphragm? So if we're trying to do an isometric, if we're trying to contract a muscle, like a physiotherapist trying to do like rehab on an injured muscle, we typically there'll be in early rehab stage, because it's the best way to start to get like neural fire into a muscle is using isometrics. But how do you isometrically contract your diaphragm? Most people, when you ask them, like just even the education on it's like, does a diaphragm contract on an inhale or an exhale? Whenever I ask that to a room of people, it's like a 50-50. And the answers are 50-50 anyway, but it's like, probably more people think it's an exhale than inhale, I would say, on average. But you can try and activate your diaphragm isometrically. So the diaphragm wants to move down and flatten out at the bottom of that rib cage on an inhale. If I hold my breath and try and breathe in, then the diaphragm is going to try to move, but it won't be able to move if I'm holding my breath. So I typically go, breathe in, breathe out. So once you finish your exhale, diaphragm's gone back up. And then pinch the nose, try breathe in. And you should feel an activation underneath that infrasternal angle of your diaphragm. Like, it feels like it's like trying to pop out or pulse, but it can't move, but you're activating it. If you feel it all in your upper chest, that's not your diaphragm. And people know they know it's not up there. So it becomes a great tool to be able to assess yourself. But as well, more than a tool, it actually becomes the exercise to go use that to teach yourself how to consciously activate the diaphragm so that it becomes subconscious when you're exercising.
And when we're talking about the diaphragm as well, I suppose people often feel that it's the air coming into the lungs that pushes the diaphragm downwards. But what you are explaining here is that the brain is monitoring primarily carbon dioxide and blood pH. And when CO2 increases and pH drops, this is during rest more so, a signal is sent from the brain to the diaphragm. The diaphragm moves downwards, which increases the volume of the thorax, which reduces the pressure inside the chest to draw air in. And then the opposite happens. The diaphragm moves back up to its resting position. You're talking about free movement of the diaphragm. So you're talking about, you don't want the diaphragm to move back but remain too flat. You need it to move back up to its resting position, because this in turn then is contributing to stabilization of the spine. And do runners get back pain? Because 50% of people with lower back pain have poor breathing. And you could argue, is it poor breathing that's contributing to lower back pain, or is it lower back pain contributing to poor breathing?
And similar with the hip flexors, like hip flexors, hamstrings, all these things are related around the lumbo-pelvic hip complex. And so in and around your hips and your lower back, like all those tissues are connected through fascia. And one that's central to all of that is that diaphragm. I think part of this conversation that I found really interesting, that was a bit of it was a bit left field, well, not left field, but it just, I wasn't expecting it. I went to see Shane Benzie, who's like a world-renowned running coach, and he looks at movement in a slightly different way, almost like poetic about the way he describes like running. Anyway, everything that he wants you to do in terms of your body positioning of like rib cage, pelvis, neck, head position, all of these things he wants you to get into for good running posture are the same things that are required for good posture, for good breathing. So the position of your rib cage will affect like how you're transferring force when you hit the floor, but as in terms of your running economy. But the position of your rib cage, because the diaphragm's attached to it, will affect the starting position, or just where the diaphragm is sitting. And the more open you are at the front of your rib cage, the more pressure you're putting your lower back, but the worse your running economy is going to be. But your diaphragm is going to start to get restricted as well. And we've seen this in some of the research, that body positions will affect the zone of apposition, the distance the diaphragm can move. So when the rib cage is stacked nicely on top of the pelvis and you're nice and tall, your running form is better, but the amount your diaphragm's able to move is going to be better as well. And it links still back into then that thoracic spine I mentioned earlier. That if you've got nice movement of your rib cage, then your spine can move. The thoracic spine should be moving. We need to be able to extend it to get long for our running form, but we should have movement through that thoracic. But if your ribs are tight, your breathing's restricted, then your tidal volume's restricted, and then you're not like the elites. You're having to just breathe faster, and then your perception of effort is higher. So it all links back into that. If those ribs can move, you start to breathe a bit more like an elite. It'll take you a bit of a while to become elite in terms of your running, but at least you're giving yourself the option and opportunity to. But when those ribs move, the spine can move because they're connected, and then your running form becomes better. You become more economical. And what Shane Benzie said to me at the end of our session and some of the conversation interviews he had was like, it feels like we're saying, he said something along the lines of, it feels like we're saying the same thing, but like from two different angles. He's coming at it from a running economy perspective. Use as least oxygen as possible by utilizing the fascial system and the alignment that you're going to have through your body so that you go across the floor more easily. Whereas I was looking at it from all those things you're saying are the same things I think you need to do to make your breathing whilst running most efficient. So you use less oxygen whilst running for breathing. And when you pair those two things together, and what's nice, when you pair those two things together, it's transformational for your running performance. But what's nice is, it's not like you're forcing these two things together. They just go together because they're the same thing. So if you attack it from whatever you want to do, you want to improve your running economy, do it from that angle. If you want to improve your breathing, do it from that angle. But they're both going to improve each other, which is a beautiful thing about it.
Yeah, for sure. The biochemical dimension, let's talk a little bit about carbon dioxide. It's a gas that I have been fascinated with. Back in the late 1990s, I practiced breathing less air and the temperature of my hands increased. I actually felt calmer in my brain, even though I felt air hunger. And from an asthma point of view, my wheezing reduced by 50% in 2 weeks. Carbon dioxide often gets completely overlooked, because it's said that it's a waste gas and it's all about oxygen. But the role carbon dioxide plays across all you're doing, and bring in breath holding as well, dynamic apneas, as well as say functional breathing and nose breathing. So let's look at carbon dioxide just to kind of tease that out a bit, Jacko, please.
It was you when I was reading the Oxford Answers that introduced this notion of like carbon dioxide isn't a waste gas, and like I didn't spend the next 2 weeks making my hands warm. I actually spent the next 2 weeks just shouting that at everybody, because I was just like, I just couldn't believe it. It was like, why? I think I felt like I enjoyed science at school. I did a science degree, like an master's degree, and I enjoyed science. And I think I've never thought this before, but you make, as I reflect it, I think at the time I felt a bit robbed by like my science experience at school. It was like, this feels like a real basic that we should have been told, right? And I think maybe I felt a bit sorry for carbon dioxide, because it gets a bad rap in sort of more globally. That's so good of you,
Jacko.
No, which I mean, it was like, it's not all his fault, it's like, and it's very different for what it's doing in terms of the earth to what it's doing inside of us. And I think that's an important point to make. And I think the biggest thing that I, sort of take, or maybe I look at it through rose-tinted glasses, but it was like this beautiful relationship where the two things like help each other, our oxygen or carbon dioxide. It's like, how amazing that the thing that the body does, the thing that it makes when it's creating energy with oxygen, it uses that thing to help with getting more of the thing that you need back in. It's beautiful. For us as then runners, it's like understanding, like anything, for all of this, I guess, from my scientific like mind has always loved going, okay, let's look at this stuff and go, what's usable from a practical perspective, and what can we train? Like, it's almost like as simple as that. And if CO2 can help with blood flow, and if CO2 can help with oxygen delivery, and if CO2 can help with reducing my perception of effort or through my breath control, because I'm going to be able to control my breathing better if I've got a higher tolerance to see like fear centers in the brain less sensitive if I've built up my CO2 tolerance. Like, does it give me some other skill sets, not just about running performance, that actually make me just a better person in the world? Because I can think a little more clearly, like in under stressful and pressured situations when people need me most. People don't need me to go run a 5K in 19 minutes. Like, they don't need that. It's just something we like to do. But yeah, so if we can, then it's like, okay, well, you with the Oxygen Advantage made it very simple. Like, how do you train like keeping CO2 in your body? Well, keep it in the body. Well, breath hold it. I think I was quite like, I don't know, breath holding. For some people, it's like, oh, gosh, that sounds just crazy. I was like, that sounds hard. Like, let's have a go at that. Like, that feels a bit weird. And I was terrible at the start. I couldn't do 20 paces walking. But now, utilizing it in like interval or repeat sprint stuff, or even some like longer intervals, but integrating breath holding into some more of like the anaerobic work rather than aerobic work, because it's not having the same necessarily. I think there's what I've seemed to experience and come across is that this thing with CO2 and the breath holding does a great job in our anaerobic training. And I saw a dramatic change in my blood lactate accumulation, utilization in the lab when we retested it, having done a lot of the breath holding work. One of the things that Xavier Warren's I think it is more of some of the more recent studies that he's put out, that CO has some sort of effect on keeping lactate in the muscle, like blocking it a little bit. So rather than doing lactate threshold work by just our traditional means of like just working pretty hard, basically, actually working pretty hard but holding the breath, you're going to get an increase in lactate from the drop in O2 because you hold breath holding, but the CO2 is like blocking the release of it. So you just have to experience it. When anyone's done I've got like a hill that I like to do hill sprints with breath holds outside the house, like one rep and your leg, this is just a sensation, so I haven't like necessarily tested this, but that sort of jelly leg like sensation that we associate with like jelly legs lactate is there almost immediately. It's wild. I think the take home with it's been for me though has just been like the effect that's had on my output, my ability to recover but also push during like anaerobic type of work, just off the charts. And the same, that's just me as N is one, but I do a lot of work with athletes where they are that type of repeat sprint type of sport, where the recovery between those repeat sprints is really important, and being able to actually go again and deal with that lactate in the system. And yeah, the difficulty with it is it's a stressor. It's like a hard exercise, and a lot of the time athletes have a lot of hard training in their program. They don't want to do something like harder or another hard session because we have to look at the total. Xavier actually said this in the interview. One thing he said at the end of the interview in the book really nicely was like, regardless of all this, he said all this like stuff about breath holding, etc. And then but something he said really nicely at the end was like, in a training week, we need to be like appreciating all of the different sessions that you're doing, and is it appropriate to like add something that's going to be ultimately like one of your hardest sessions physiologically of the week. I've tried to decipher things for athletes where it's done really short and sharp. It's like a 10-15 minute session and it's intense, but it's over real quick. And the recovery from that can be really quite good if you pair it with, right, we've done something really hard. Now we're going to do like all of your down regulation breathing stuff, and getting them buying into it from that angle as well. Pairing the, something I've said all through the whole of the book is like pairing all this stuff together. Like get better at running and get better at breathing and do them together. Do the hard stuff, do the recovery stuff. Just do it all integrated together. That's where you're going to see the most results.
Yeah, I like the breath holding myself, I have to say. And pushing it to the point that you're lowering your blood oxygen saturation down into the mid-80s. But I like your point there. It can be very off-putting for some people, especially if they have a very strong reaction to the buildup of air hunger. It could be people who have been exposed to some kind of severe trauma, or if they have a predisposition towards panic disorder, etc. But I suppose the thing is, Jacko, we can change the dose and duration. You can start off as gentle as you want and build up, that kind of way. So there's no pressure on anybody to push it to the extremes. In actual fact, I think what we're doing, there's a lot of extreme out there in the breathing world anyway, and we're not going to add to it. There is a point at which we push people, but there's also a point at which we actually pare it back as well. I'd like to get an insight into your life with your integration of breathing, and what would you normally do and where do you see it being beneficial to? So, for example, do you have your mouth closed during sleep? When you do your physical exercise, do you make a conscious effort to breathe through your nose for part of it? Do you switch to mouth breathing? If you're stressed, do you use breathing? The practical sense of it.
Yeah. No, it's a non-negotiable for like the daily breathing habits to be nasal. I like to try to have some sort of like, whether you call it a breathing meditation, or I like to do something in the morning with my coffee. We've got a little ice bath and sauna set up at home. So like it's nice the sauna is a place where it's like no phones allowed. Like you just sit and chat, or you do some humming. Like I love humming for the vagus nerve and just slowing down those exhales for that relaxation response. So there's some staples that are like part of what I do just on a day to day, just normally. Training wise, it's then a case of choosing the right sort of, what do I want out of this session? And then going, okay, this is the purpose of the session. This is what I want out of it. What's going to help serve that the most? So if I'm training at the moment to run 2 marathons a day for 2 brain injury charities for 100 days, starting 29th of May. So I'm doing a lot of running, but it's like, so today already, I've run 30 kilometers today. After this podcast is finished, I've got another interview and then I'm going to run another 10K, but it's all I'm doing like 9 kilometers an hour pace. Like it's not very fast. And so it's all nasal. There's absolutely, I'm probably breathing about 40 liters of air or something. It's not challenging for my breathing because I've practiced that a lot. It would have been at the start. I wouldn't have been able to manage that at the start, but now it's like, it's really easy. And one of the things I love the most with those easy sessions is syncing breathing with your foot strikes, something called locomotor respiratory coupling. So I'm running like, it takes me 4 steps on my inhale and 5 steps on my exhale. Keeps my breathing rate nice and calm. It sort of hypnotizes you into a bit of a hypnotic state. So like you just get really zoned in on just the sound of your foot and then the sensation and feeling of your diaphragm. And one of the things that's quite nice we haven't touched on is when your diaphragm is we talked about the diaphragm on an inhale, contracts and pulls downwards. So it's pulling down. When your foot hits the ground, gravity's pulling you down. One thing researchers have shown that, again, elites naturally do this, apparently, when observed, but it's something you can train, that you want the initiation of your diaphragm contraction to happen in sync with when your foot hits the floor. Because when your foot hits the floor, those ground reaction forces are pulling you down. The diaphragm wants to go down. You essentially, as the researchers say, you get some free energy for that diaphragm. So you can, the numbers quoted in the research was like 10% increase in ventilation with no extra like effort or energy cost. So it can be really quite beneficial. I think one of the things I find most beneficial about it though is just that like how it just zones you in. But yeah, that's a lot of my slow running now. Faster pace sessions, like I said, I can get up to a pretty reasonable pace. Like 20 minutes for a 5K is about my limit of my nasal threshold. So anything up to there, I'm nasal. I don't know why. I've never really got on with like nose in, mouth out. If I can go nose in, I can also go nose out. I don't really ever use that option. I don't know whether I just should have invested more time in it, maybe or something. I don't know. But just for me, it's just not something I've ever used. So I'll go from nose to that turtle power, and then if that's too much because I'm doing like a session that's designed to like improve VO2 max, say or some harder pace sessions where I am above that threshold, I'll use the mouth, but it's always a non-negotiable that the diaphragm is driving it and I'm in control of the speed of the breathing. And I'll get down to like a 2-step inhale, 2-step exhale, but no shorter than that. If you go shorter than that, you're not in control. So that's like the shortest step breath ratio that we or I would advocate using, but the same as what has been seen in the research. But in those sessions, there's typically like an effort that might be like 3-4 minutes, 5 minutes, a kilometer or whatever, but then there'll be like a rest period or a recovery period where it's like get back to nasal quickly, depending on the session, might actually dump off some CO2 to allow that process to happen so I can recover quickly. So I can get heart rate down quickly so I can go hard again. And then there'll be other sessions where it's like the priority is actually like accumulating lactate, building up some CO2 tolerance, and we're actually like doing breath holds whilst like sprinting up the hill, like I said, is behind me. So I like to have some variety in my training. I found that really beneficial. And then what's nice about that variety in the types of running sessions is there's a breathing tool that you can use to enhance the session that you're doing in the session, the recovery from the session, or recovery in the session as well. So, but it would be probably, I'd sort of guess a number on it. It would be I bet, if you think that a typical training session, it's about 80-20. I think I've heard you talk about this. Shane Benzie talks about it. Everyone talks about it in the training world. Like 20% like is hard. So that might need you to mouth breathe. Depends. But then the 80% that's easy, that's a real chance for you to use nasal to improve your mouth breathing for when you do need to use it and benefit from all those other things that we've talked about.
And I think that's a good point as well, that we're not saying that you should be, solely nasal breathing. Okay, we encourage it with recreational athletes, but there's a point at which if the intensity of air hunger is too much and it's too uncomfortable, it's never about forcing breath through the nose, because that could possibly, it wouldn't be good for the nose.
Well, I tried that at the start and it was just miserable and I made no progress. No, literally, I just made no progress.
That's enough. Yeah.
I did. It was like, I thought nasal breathing was supposed to be good for me. And I was like, I just talk about like sucking it up like a Hoover. Like it was, it didn't, So definitely not forcing it. Slow down,
Slow down. Or I actually find a nasal, because I have a deviated septum and I've got one side smaller than the other. Yeah. I have to use a nasal dilator. So for people or listeners, just to use the Cottle maneuver, just to prise open your nostrils, because if you're doing running, you can wear a nasal dilator. There's no, it just allows you to maintain easier nasal breathing during your exercise. Yeah. Coming back to, you spoke about Warren's papers, and I think they're brilliant because they really kind of add credence to what we do in terms of breath holds at the end of an exhale. For somebody who's new to this, we don't do hyperventilation prior to doing breath holding during movement. But his paper with rugby union players in Australia, I think it's a 2018 paper. He got 21 rugby union players. He split them into two groups. He had one group, he measured their repeated sprintability before exhaustion. And pre-trial, it was in around 9 reps before exhaustion. Yeah. And then he had them do breath hold training. And there wasn't that many sessions, 7 or 8 sessions a week, 7 or 8 reps over 4 weeks. And then he measured their repeated sprintability, which is a performance indicator in team sports. And in the group who were doing the sprinting with breath holding, they increased their repeated sprintability by 64% from 9 reps to 14.8 reps. And the group who did normal breathing during their sprints increased marginally, what you'd expect.
Like it was 6%.
6%, correct.
So it's a tenfold increase. Wild.
But it's unbelievable because these are professional athletes in peak season, 21 years of age. And
that was one of the biggest things was it was in season. You don't ask any S&C coach in season, you're just really looking to maintain. You're not really ever seeing people do PBs in anything during the season. So to have that difference in just 4 weeks, you'd think you could walk into any rugby club in the country, tell them that, and you'd have a job for life. Because you go, I can show you how to do this. But it isn't, I guess it just isn't as simple. It is as simple as that, but it isn't. That there's still like a long way to go before everybody's fully bought into that. I've done a lot of that breath holding type of work with some rugby teams, with good effect. But there's a number of factors that go into like practically making that happen easily. And I'd probably say one of the biggest things is like people actually believing it. You know, people just don't. You can show them that paper, and they're just like, just not bothered. I don't know for why, I don't know, but for whatever reason. But yeah, that's.
But it's a paper that's not alone, because I was just reading some papers yesterday, and I think there were a couple of papers, one by Wang and one by Wendy in 2023, and Wendy's paper also looked at rugby players. Okay, hematocrit, hemoglobin didn't change, but other parameters absolutely did change. You know, so it's almost as if
I had someone do a PB on bench press after making him do one breath hold walking in the gym. So it was a different mechanism. It was more like ramping up sympathetic activation of the nervous system, but same principle of like using a breath hold to elicit a response in the body. He was like, afterwards, like looked at me and he was like, "That's weird." And I was like, "Well, yeah, like it's cool, isn't it?" Like, and he was like, "Well, yeah." And he was a bit like sort of shocked, really. And I was like, "We just did something for your nervous system, and your nervous system for like output of like max force or max power or something like that, like it's controlled by your nervous system is dictating that." So there's a lot in the breath holding above of what we've already discussed. There was one that I've got in the book, actually. I won't even remember the title of it off the top of my head, but they did some breath holding before a VO2 max test, and their time to exhaustion increased by just doing 5 breath holds before. And I think one of the troubles with some of the research is that like they haven't particularly well defined like a standardized protocol to test. So it's like some groups of researchers did like a really like a breath hold with skipping, and then went and tested something bloody else. And it was like, if you make someone skip and do a really easy breath hold, I can tell you it's going to do nothing. It'd be like someone in a car accident and their legs hanging off, and I give them half a paracetamol. It ain't going to do anything. I thought of that analogy this morning. But like, it's got to be, if you're trying to get the body to elicit a response from the body, it's got to challenge it. Like we know that in strength and conditioning and everything else that we do, and you can hear me getting a bit like passionate about it. It's like we're starting to, and it's coming, but it's slow. But we've not been treating breathing with the same like strength and conditioning lens as the other systems in the body. And one of the things that I've been doing and want to try and make accessible for more and more people is like, let's look at those like training opportunities, and breath holding is definitely one, and it's multi-dimensional. There's like the lactate bit that we've already talked about. There's the potential increase in like red blood cell from spleen, that side of it. But then there's also like, what's it doing to like the sympathetic activation of the nervous system that may be beneficial depending on the thing that you're going in to do.
The potential is enormous. And I know, many people who are already into breathing, they know, they get it. There's a massive following coming up behind it. The research does have to catch up. Universities, it would be tremendous for the researchers in universities to start delving more and more into this. And there's so many different applications. It's not just about performance, but oftentimes I think about recovery, mental health, airway function. And even if you look at the more recent papers looking at people with chronic heart failure, when there was one paper looking at what happens when you get them breathing in and out through their nose, as opposed to mouth breathing with chronic heart failure. And this would be based back on Bernardi's papers back 20 years ago. Yeah. It's starting to happen. So what's your projection for the next 5 years, other than thinking that nasal breathing during running is going to be the best? It's going to be something out there, which I made this, like a prediction. I said, listen, nasal breathing during physical movement is going to be a big thing within the next 5 years. But I don't want to put words into your mouth.
Yeah. I'd like to go into a room and ask people, does the diaphragm contract on an inhale and exhale? And everyone tell me that it contracts on an inhale. You know, like I guess there's some like absolute basics that we've never been taught that are the foundation for us to actually like be able to use some of these tools like sensibly or effectively. And so I joke about that, but it is true. Like, you know, the three big things for me is like the speed of your breathing, being able to control that, the use of your diaphragm, being able to activate it, and your ribcage position. All those three things are in play regardless of whether you breathe through your nose or your mouth. So then the nose or mouth is then these things have to be in place. And then you then make a sensible decision about whether, is this beyond my nasal threshold or not? Is this going to be beneficial for me to breathe through my nose or my mouth at this particular intensity of the thing that I'm doing? Is this going to be good for my heart to breathe through my nose? Or what is it? What is the purpose of this? So that's like that's the bedrock that, having written the book, came out. It's like from all of the research, all of the experts, it's clear as day that like those things are like they're just the foundation, and they're the things that you can positively influence all of those things. And it's gonna change, like you said. It's gonna change your performance, but it's gonna change your sleep. It's gonna change how you manage stress. It'll change how you recover. It will change how you manage nerves before a race. You know, it will change all these things that go around the periphery of it. But all those things also do impact your performance. So even if someone just wants it from a performance perspective, you could actually just do all of the things unrelated to performance, and you'll see an improvement in your performance for sure. My prediction over the next 5 years, that's difficult to say, isn't it? It's like you always feel like, oh, we're right on the cusp, and it's just the wave is just gonna, and then everyone's gonna be. And I think it takes longer than we think, but there has been a change, and you do feel it. And when I have a conversation, I have a conversation with somebody about breathing for exercise now, like it's not met with that like block that it used to be. 5 years ago, there was just a block, just straight block. Whereas now it's like, oh yeah, I've read James Nestor's book, or oh, I've read the Oxyvantage, or oh, I've heard about X, or I've heard about Y, or oh, I don't know if I'm using my diaphragm. There's an intrigue there, which I guess all I really am asking for people is to like have a little look in this box of tricks and tools that you've probably never used or trained before, and have a play with them, give them a chance, and see which ones work for you.
Absolutely. And it's never going to be a waste of somebody's time, you know. Jacko, I love the conversation. Thanks so much for your time with it.
Pleasure.
The name of your book, do you have a copy of the book there in front of you? Can you show us?
Oh, this is a little thing.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah. Breathe smarter, run stronger.
I take it to bed at the moment. My wife has to sleep in the spare room now. I've just got like a big box of books next to me. Yeah.
There's something very exciting after writing a book when you actually receive it
forward by
in
Patrick
paperback
McKeown.
or in hard, isn't there?
Yeah,
Jacko, because there's a lot of work goes into a book. But
I cried my eyes out
when you just pick it up for the first time and you say, "This is a physical reality now." You know, it's an amazing feeling, isn't it?
The editor said to me, I went down to London to pick it up. The editor said he had like the first copy. He was like, it's behind reception. He was like, pick it up. He was like, go to a fancy coffee shop, get yourself a nice coffee, just sit there and have a moment to digest. And he says, like, I was like, just a bit of a warning, like some people find it quite a difficult time to do. And I was like, mate, I'll be fine. Like, what are you about? Like, I'm pumped. I want to see it. And I sat there on the steps outside of Bloomsbury. I did a video call with my wife. And I was just like looking at it, and I was like, it's why, you know, for me, sort of off topic of running, like my brain injury story is like in the introduction, it's part of my story. But even before that, at school, my English teacher, I'll name and shame her because it's interesting. Her name was Mrs. English. I just thought her name was Mrs. English.
How appropriate.
Yeah. I got told I'd fail English. My mum and dad took me to extra English lessons on a Saturday morning, and I hated them. And they took me to, if I went to the English lesson on a Saturday morning, they took me to McDonald's afterwards as a treat. It was like, oh, actually poisoning me, but that was the time. That was, but I'm so grateful that my mum and dad, like, they believed in me, and it was like, yeah, you might have to do a bit more work, but we're going to help you do that. Because there's no, I didn't think I would never, they didn't do that because they thought I'd write a book. It was just like, so I could scrape through English at school because I knew it was important. But like, so when I look at this book now, I see my brain injury and I see that little boy that got told you'd fail English. And it's like, it stands to me more than just a book about breathing for running. But it's, I guess, no other people won't see it. That's what I see in it when I look at it, but that's a personal thing, I guess. And
there's a great message in that as well. Don't take seriously other people's comments, because it's very easy for people to put people down. Yeah. And sometimes you just rise up, and sometimes that can be a motivation. You're saying to yourself, well, I'm going to show this person. Why don't you send her a copy? That's what you need to do now, yeah?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, probably will. She's probably a mouth breather, Patrick.
That's it. Yeah, needs a little bit more blood flow and oxygen going to that brain. So yeah, make better comments than that. At least comments that are going to be helpful for kids, as opposed to putting them down. We don't need any of that. Jacko, it was a pleasure. For people to find out more about your work,
yeah, the book is available on Amazon and Waterstones and Bloomsbury and everywhere. Best place to connect with me is probably on my Instagram, which is The Breath Running Coach. So The Breath Running Coach. Website is thebreathrunningcoach.com.
Thanks very much, Jacko. Loved it.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Oxygen Advantage podcast. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe and maybe take the time to leave us a review. The Oxygen Advantage podcast is available from all your podcast providers.